Good evening. Welcome to the Kelly Wright Show from my home in Maryland. We'll get right to it. There's a lot to talk about today. So my opening observations are based on something that I read on Twitter. It states this: for the first time in history, you can help save humanity by sitting on the couch, watching TV, and surfing the internet. For God's sake, don't mess this up. It's just that serious, and it's just that simple. Stay at home, save a life, including your own. And those are my opening observations. My first guest is Congressman Bobby Scotti, is the chair of the Education and Labor Committee. And Congressman, right now we're in the full-on apex for New York City. I want to start there and your concerns about what we're seeing there, according to Governor Cuomo, and even the President of the United States has said this would be a very tough week. And certainly we are seeing that in the New York area.
Well, we've heard of this described as the 9/11 or Pearl Harbor moment. It's really not Pearl Harbor or 9/11. Those are surprise attacks. We've seen this coming on for months. The predictions have been there. The projections and modeling have been there to know that this situation is going to get extremely bad unless we do something to change the trajectory. When we had 1 week, we had 200 deaths. The next week, we had about 1,000 deaths, and that's not that bad except the trajectory that we're on. There's an old adage that if you don't change directions, you'll end up where you're headed. Well, if we don't change directions, 1,000 has become about 7,000, and now it's going on to even more and more, and we may be going, if we don't change directions, to hundreds of thousands of deaths. So we have to take this seriously. You can't say that things are going to get well, it's going to disappear. We have to take it seriously. One of the things I like about the mask is that it not only protects other people from you, it doesn't give that much protection for yourself, but a lot of people are what they call asymptomatic, no symptoms, but they're still contagious. A mask can protect other people from them. It also keeps you from touching your face. But the most important message it is that things are not normal. You go out to the grocery store and people are wearing masks. It reminds you that this is serious. And that's why the governors have shut down businesses, have shut down schools, totally ruined the economy. If you look at the stock market, it ruined the economy, but the alternative is millions of people dying. And so the governors that took the action earliest are the ones where states are having the best results. Those that waited late are having worse results.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has talked about that will likely be an additional $1 trillion that all of you will start working on at some point, but you're all scattered in different areas of the country. How will you be able to bring this together in a timely fashion to make that happen? My understanding is that on the Senate side, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has also agreed that we have to get to this other tranche of $1 trillion.
Well, one of the things we're finding is that although the overall bill we passed a few days ago was adequate, we're finding that there within the bill some inadequacies. $350 billion for small businesses. At the rate we're going, that money is going to be gone before all the applications are considered. I think there's a consensus that there'd be more money on that line item. Education, you've got colleges and K through 12 trying to educate people without them being there in the colleges, without tuition and room and board. You're trying to keep the faculty and the infrastructure of the college together. There's a lot we have to do in education. OSHA regulations, we're talking about dealing with the fact that many people are working in conditions that are not safe. The solution, maybe hazardous pay would be helpful, but we need to make sure that OSHA has an enforceable regulation to deal with infectious diseases. We've been considering this regulation for 10 years, and yet nothing has been done. For the last 3 years, we've been working on the administration to try to release the CDC guidelines and make them enforceable guidelines so that people will not be working in unsafe conditions. It's not just the healthcare workers that are subject to infectious disease. It's first responders, TSA agents, grocery store clerks, taxi cab drivers. A lot of people need protection from infectious diseases, and OSHA needs to make sure that they have an enforceable standard.
I'm talking to Congressman Bobby Scott, chair of the House Education and Labor Committee. We'll be back with more of the interview in just a moment. So much ahead of us, and yet the president says he sees a glimmer of hope. Do you see any glimmer of hope right now? I mean, Americans are very optimistic, they're very resolute, and yet this is a very hideous disease that's hit us.
Well, we're resolute in the fact that people are taking it seriously. We're doing the best we can with it. At the rate we were going, you went from 200 to the next week, 1,000 to the next week, about 6,000. We're over 10,000 now. At the rate we were going, it was about tenfold every 10 days. Well, if you're at 10,000 now, by the end of the month, you're clearly at 100,000 deaths. And unless there's an old adage, if you don't change directions, you're going to end up where you're headed. We were headed towards millions of deaths, but because people took it seriously, no help from the president, because people took it seriously and sheltered in place, there is significantly less transmission of this virus than we would have had we still been going to ball games and concerts and large church services and everything else. People have taken it seriously, and it's made a difference. As we keep talking about bending the curve, if you look at the curve in Kentucky where the governor took early action compared to the curve in Tennessee where the governor delayed action, the infection rate in Tennessee is about 5 times worse than it is in Kentucky. So there are things that you can do. The shelter in place does work. It bends the curve. But we have to continue taking it seriously. Now is not the time to take your foot off, to put the brakes on and scale back. We need to keep going the way we're going until we get the test so we know what's going on. The only weapon we have is the shelter in place. And people are abiding with it. The governors are issuing the orders, and it's making a difference. But if we do the best we can, we will save millions of lives.
Very good. Congressman Bobby Scott, we appreciate you. Just a final question. Your message to America, how do you infuse hope in the midst of what to some looks like bleak and despair?
Well, we've taken unprecedented action in terms of making sure that people's income is protected. We're sending out checks. It's just a matter of the executive branch getting the money out of Washington. Unprecedented support for small businesses, and there will be more. When people lose their jobs, they lose their health insurance. We need to make sure that health insurance continues. We need to make sure there's protection on voting. We need to make sure that there's support for education and other areas where we need desperate help. There'll be an infrastructure bill, so when things start turning around, we'll have those economic stimulus. We'll have an economic stimulus with a transportation, education, and housing infrastructure policy. There's a lot we're doing, and if people just hang on, we'll get through this. We're a strong country, but the main issue is that we have to take this seriously, and we'll get through it.
Thank you, sir. Congressman Bobby Scott. And as always, we are praying that you will stay safe and well as all the other members there on Capitol Hill. It's a lot to do, and we know that you have a Herculean task on your hands, and we are certainly keeping you in prayer. God bless you, and thank you for representing the great state or the great Commonwealth of Virginia.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Kelly. Keep up the good work.
Thanks, Congressman. Joining me on the program now is Paris Denard. Many of you know him by now. He is an advisor to the president, but he's also the RNC communications director and senior advisor in terms of what's happening with the Black community. Paris, good of you to join us again today. This new normal keeps getting more abnormal, and yet we're trying to see that there is some glimmer of hope, as the president has talked about, but that glimmer is still just a slither, if you will, on the medical front. Yet we are still finding out that there's progress to be made. Tell me what's happening right now in terms of the president's response and the coronavirus task force.
So, Kelly, thanks for having me on the show again. It's always a pleasure to be with you and your audience. We know that top of mind is the COVID-19 pandemic, and there's two things that are working right now that are coming out of the president's coronavirus task force. One is the obvious health emergency, the health issue from around this, and we know it's particularly hitting the Black community extra hard because of the fact that it attacks strongly compromised immune systems. And our community, when you look at high blood pressure and heart disease and diabetes and all these other asthma, a lot of these physical challenges that really are impacting our community greatly, this vicious, evil terrorist of a virus goes right to the most vulnerable. But I want everyone to be mindful. It's not just something that's attacking the Black community, it's attacking everyone. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you sit and recall the fact that the Prince, the future King of England, had COVID-19, the current Prime Minister of England, white gentleman, is in ICU because of COVID-19. It is touching everyone, regardless of their socioeconomic background or if they look like me or you. But we have to be mindful of the reality of how it is impacting our community, like the Surgeon General, Jerome Adams, continues to talk about. We've got to observe the president's guidelines for 30 days to slow the spread. But there is, as you mentioned, glimmers of hope on the health front. When you look at hydrochloroquine, this is something that the FDA is rapidly trying to get the clinical trials in place because we're at war against this invisible virus. And so it is something that is making an impact in people's lives.
Absolutely. On this show yesterday, we spoke with a gentleman who tested positive for COVID-19. He was in the hospital with pneumonia. They treated him with the same drug, and he is now at home convalescing, just using oxygen. But more than that, he's alive and well and talking about it. And he too touts this as being a good treatment. And like you, he said it's not for everybody, but for him, it's definitely worked. Moving on, there's also the economic front, Paris. What's happening on that front with PPP?
Well, Kelly, that's very true. We are fighting two issues, the health impact and the economic impact. And I would just encourage all of your viewers to really pay close attention to the Paycheck Protection Program, because there are billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars set aside, specifically $350 billion for small businesses. And there was a clarification made. Senator Tim Scott out of South Carolina led to have the inclusion of churches, charities, and nonprofits included in this piece of legislation called the CARES Act. And so what actually happens is, if you are a church, you are a nonprofit, barbershop, if you are a salon, boutique owner, dentist, small business, mortician, whatever you're doing, and you have under 500 employees, you can now have this 100% forgivable loan as long as the money that you get goes towards payroll, utilities, and rent. So if you furloughed some employees, if you have let people go, or you're trying to hold on to your team because you know that as soon as we come out of this, you're going to open up the doors full swing and get this economy going again, please go on to the SBA, the Small Business Administration's website, sba.gov, and apply for this loan. Now, there's been some challenges, frankly speaking, with some of the banks getting the online portals working and some of the criteria that they're putting, but we've seen Bank of America has been probably the leading lender And so I would encourage all of your listeners who are small business owners. And look, there are over 2 million Black-owned businesses in America. Majority of them are Black-owned women businesses. This includes LLCs and sole proprietors and people in the gig economy. Go to the SBA or talk to your lender and say, listen, I'm trying to keep the doors open. I want to pay rent, utilities, and I want to pay my staff. Call your lender and say, what are your tips? Who should we contact if it's not Bank of America or some of these other banks? Because this is a lifeline. And Kelly, what I don't want to happen is after we get through COVID-19, and we're going to beat it, but when we get through it, then all of these Black small business owners, and we saw unprecedented low unemployment in the Black community, and we know that Black small businesses are the bedrock of our community. They provide jobs and goods and services for us, and we love to support them. I come from Black-owned businesses, my grandfather, my mother, and so what I would hate to see is after this, so many of them close because they didn't have the information and the access to these funds that are there. Go to SBA.gov, apply for Paycheck Protection Program, get this money because it can save your business.
Paris Denard, we thank you for being on the show as always. We look forward to talking to you on a weekly basis because there's so much information you can bring to all Americans. But we thank you so much for being particularly focused on what's happening with Black America here on the Kelly Wright Show as it airs on the Black News Channel. Paris Denard, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Kelly.
And we'll be back with more after this. Joining me now is Sean Campbell. He's a friend of mine. He's also a documentarian. He has a wonderful documentary out about Arthur Wharton, the first Black footballer, dating back to the late 1800s. Many people were not aware of that, Sean, but yet the Arthur Wharton story is looming large and has influenced people like Usain Bolt, Stevie Wonder, and you're the one who brought it to light. And while that's true, it's also true that your documentary and your plans for moving forward are kind of on hold because of this COVID-19 pandemic. How are people in the UK responding to this?
Well, the thing is, Kelly, you know, the whole world is in lockdown, as it seems, so everything's on hold. It's a very unique experience. I don't think there's not a person alive who's ever been through anything like this, so it's new for all of us. And what we're seeing is a changing face of the world, you know. We've got a situation now where the environment is clean, but people are dying. I mean, it's just such a contradictory place to be. You know, we had a remarkable day in the United Kingdom on Sunday when we had the Queen's speech, which was extremely dignified. It was, we can't call it a rousing speech, but it was a speech that was very sincere, it was very unifying, it transcended all barriers, and she never once actually mentioned COVID-19. It was a message about anything to do with being in the face of adversity, and it was very much welcomed. And of course, on the very same day, our Prime Minister was taken into hospital, and he's now in intensive care. And it was just the most extraordinary of days, you know, it was so remarkable.
So for you personally, Sean, as well as your family, when you heard the inspiring and encouraging message from the Queen, and then the devastating news about the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, going into the hospital, and now he's in ICU because of this coronavirus, how are you and your family responding to that?
Well, we are all, the strange thing, Kelly, is that all of us, regardless of colour, race, religion, creed, are having to find new ways of communicating, ways which we're not really comfortable with. I want to hold my grandchildren. I have a grandson being born in 2 weeks. And she's, my daughter is some 65, 70 miles away from where I am now. And she is absolutely adamant, my daughter, that she wants us there for the birth. She'd like my wife, Fiona, to be the birthing partner. And we're having to go to extraordinary lengths to make sure that we're prepared for this, unlike my other 5 grandchildren, where it was fairly straightforward. And then you hear that the Prime Minister of the country is in intensive care, and you realise that this horror that is affecting all of us can reach the very top. It's a real leveller. Pregnant women, of course, they're also on the high risk list. So we have that concern for our daughter, as well as for our soon-to-be born grandson. And it's a worrying time for us all. But then to hear the words of the Queen and that steely resolve, and it's the first time she's made a speech like that since 1940 that she's had to address the nation. And it makes you realise that a cup of tea does sometimes fix things for the Brits. So we've been drinking lots of tea.
That's good, my friend. And our prayers for you from this side to your side, going up for you, because I know that while your numbers are not as high as the United States, still it is very alarming when the leader of your country is battling this, and you know that friends and other people are battling, and just the situation that you're going through with the expected birth of your 6th grandchild. By the way, congratulations.
Thank you. So, yeah, I'm very proud.
Yeah, you don't look old enough to have 5 grandchildren working on number 6, but God bless you. You should be very proud, and keep us up to date about what's happening with our friends in the UK, Great Britain, because we are always concerned about you and other people around the world. Like you said, this is a global pandemic, and it knows no color, no creed, no nationality. And apparently, because of the fact that your prime minister is now in ICU, it certainly has no respect for titles or presidents or prime ministers.
If I could just to say one other thing, Kelly, just very briefly. There's quite an extraordinary thing happening, which is that it's the first time that people of all classes, regardless of where you are on that ladder, people are starting to understand that their liberty, there's pressure on people's liberty. Yeah. It's something the Black communities had to cope with all of our lives. And for the first time ever, white community and other communities are feeling the pressure of having your liberty tested. It's quite a leveler. It's an interesting one. Watch this space on that.
It is interesting indeed, and we've been talking about this on the show as well, how it is a leveler, and we have to pay attention to it and focus on how we can all embrace each other and come together, one humanity network coming together, actually to build this beloved community. So I appreciate you, Sean. Thanks for weighing in on this, and we're praying for your Prime Minister and stiff upper lip.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Kelly. All about the love train.
I'll have exactly the love train. I'll have a spot of tea after this. Thank you, my friend. Welcome back, and joining me now is Dr. Yolanda Hancock. She's a pediatrician and also works in public health. She is really knowledgeable about what's going on with COVID-19. And Doc, good of you to join us again today, but this is a difficult day for many of us. As you know, the numbers in New York, the death toll has risen to its highest. Mm-hmm. And of course, we're seeing, as you've said on this program, time and time again, this would adversely impact African Americans, and we're seeing it in other cities. Tell me what's going on within our community.
I'm glad that we're bringing this up again. I think it's important for every single American to understand why it's important to collect information like gender, race, and socioeconomic status so that we can recognize when certain populations are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And we're seeing that today. When we look at cities across the country, cities like Milwaukee, cities like New Orleans, we're seeing that African Americans specifically are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And that doesn't just speak to the risk of being an African American in terms of acquiring COVID-19, it speaks to the health disparities and health inequities that existed well before this pandemic began. We look at cities like New Orleans, in the state where I'm from, what we're seeing is that close to 70% of COVID-19 patients are African American, but Blacks only make up 32% of the population in the entire state of Louisiana. And that's for a variety of reasons that we can definitely get into.
Well, those reasons are underlying reasons as it relates to the health disparities like respiratory illnesses and things of that nature, Doc?
Absolutely. When we look at issues of social justice and where impoverished communities are placed, particularly in Louisiana, there's actually a place called Cancer Row, where a lot of the chemical plants, the oil refineries are located right next to neighborhoods that make up a majority of African American residents. And when you see those disproportionate placements of neighborhoods next to high-risk areas, you're going to see increased risk of asthma and other pulmonary diseases that put people at an increased risk of acquiring COVID-19 and succumbing to COVID-19 infection. We also have to understand healthcare systems, healthcare access. What is the access of African Americans in cities like New Orleans? New Orleans is still in recovery from Katrina. One of the largest hospitals that provided care to African Americans in New Orleans shut down. Charity Hospital shut down after Katrina, and no system replaced it. Tulane expanded their services. LSU attempted to expand their services, but particularly for lower income families and Black families living in New Orleans, they have very limited access. They're doing the best they can, but COVID-19 is definitely putting a lot of these health inequities under a microscope.
And in addition to New Orleans and Milwaukee, there's also the report today that most of the deaths occurring in Chicago within the African American community.
Right.
It's extremely alarming.
It is, and I think it's important to also understand positions of privilege, right? So we start talking to people about social isolation, social distancing, self-isolation, getting masks. If you're resource challenged, if you are a family of 4 living in a 2-bedroom apartment with 1 bathroom, how are you going to self-isolate? That's a luxury that a lot of people just do not have, whether they are African American or not. But what we do know, looking at stats even before COVID-19, is that African Americans are disproportionately affected by poverty. And it isn't because we're not capable, it's because there have been systems in place in terms of social justice, racial injustice, institutional racism that have facilitated what we're seeing now with this pandemic.
It's alarming, Doctor. And do you see any way of the African American community getting out of this perhaps less unscathed than what we are? What should we do to stem the tide and turn it around?
I think one of the most important ways in which we do this is to acknowledge that we are at risk. If you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this notion that somehow African Americans were immune. So some of us did not take it as seriously as we should, which certainly increases our risk, but that does not explain why we're seeing such disproportionate numbers in a lot of communities, right? I think it's important for us to acknowledge that race is a risk factor in COVID-19 infection and in COVID-19 death, to make sure that we're providing each other with the equipment, the resources that are needed in order to protect ourselves. Just last night, I posted a video on Facebook and posted it on YouTube to demonstrate how everybody can make a mask. Not everyone has the resources to buy an N95. Not everyone even has the resources to buy a fabric mask, but I want people to be able to go out and buy shop towels at Advanced Auto Parts and buy a packet. You get 55 towels, you can make 22 masks at like cents on the dollar. So if you know of somebody who does not have a mask, it breaks my heart to see people with pictures of water jugs over their heads or using their tennis shoes or a maxi pad to serve as a mask. Everyone should be able to protect themselves regardless of their socioeconomic status. And it's up to us, the professionals, to make sure that we're advocating and providing those resources and the education to make sure that we are all protected, particularly our vulnerable communities.
Dr. Yolanda Hancock, that is quite a bit of information for all of us to digest. It's very sobering. We have to do the right thing and take care of ourselves. I want to thank you once again for being on the program. I know there's so much more we can talk about. Time doesn't allow it, so we have to have you back as often as possible. And to your family in Louisiana, my prayer, sincere prayer, goes out to them. and for all of our people who are suffering from this, and all people, black, white, whatever, we know that this is a problem. But to your family, particularly right now, since I'm talking to you, I am praying for you and your family. God bless you, and thanks for being on the program.
Thank you.
All right. Welcome back to the Kelly Wright Show. Joining me now is Del Bigtree. He is an American film producer and television producer, but he also produces a program called The High Wire. And he has explored a lot about vaccinations. You may recall his involvement with the production of Vaxxed, and he joins me now to weigh in on vaccination since everybody's talking about it in the wake of COVID-19, the global pandemic. Del, what's your opinion about the vaccinations that President Trump has been touting in terms of treating this coronavirus with malaria vaccines?
Well, first of all, the malaria drug, chloroquine, is not a vaccine. It's a drug that we use for malaria. I suppose we may be looking at it as a preventative, so using it prior to infection, which would sort of put it in the realm of a vaccine, but it's not a vaccine. I want to be clear about that. They are working on a vaccine for COVID-19. We've been told that that could be 12 to 18 months out. And the research I've done on that vaccine, people need to know it's a very, very dangerous vaccine. It's one of the most difficult vaccines we've ever attempted to make. After the SARS coronavirus epidemic, they attempted to make a vaccine for coronavirus to deal with SARS. And every animal trial, and there was multiple attempts from drug companies around the world, every animal trial showed that the vaccine looked like it was safe. But then when they put the animal in contact with the coronavirus, they actually got more sick than they would have had they not had the vaccine. Many of those animals died. It's a problem called antibody immune enhancement. They don't know why it happens, but there's a potential that a vaccine could make people more sick, and they're trying to figure out how to get around that. So to me, the discussions about, a future vaccine is our only hope. We are talking about something that at the moment is like a unicorn. It doesn't exist. So to be talking about something that doesn't exist as our way out of this, to me, does not make sense. Science isn't based on dreams. It's not based on wishful thinking. It's based on facts. And currently, we do not have a vaccine for coronavirus that is capable of working without making people, or animals anyway, more sick than they would have been. So obviously, there's a lot of work that needs to be done there.
To your point, I just spoke to a patient yesterday who had or has coronavirus. He was in the hospital with pneumonia. He had a weak heart. They treated him with this chloroquine, and as a result of that, he is now out of the hospital, up and walking around, staying quarantined, and using oxygen as opposed to being on a ventilator. That is a good result for him, and he also touts it as being something that perhaps saved his life. So to your point, do you see any other kind of current drug out there, or any kind of treatment that can go along with this kind of chloroquine that they're using right now?
Well, we know that they're doing trials on, I believe it's called remdesivir, and we're also looking at trials using antibodies that are already in people's, like using blood products made from people that have already gotten through the illness. So there's a lot of different approaches. I think we should be doing trials on all these things. I mean, coronavirus has ultimately always been here. This is something that we've gone through year after year after year. This may be one that is stronger than others. Only history will tell us how deadly this ended up being. But there will be a future world where we will have coronaviruses in the future. Some may be even worse than this. So anytime we have an opportunity to be in trials on people, then we should be exploring every avenue. But I think people that are really coming out against these trials are saying we can't trust chloroquine. Look, when you're in the throes of death, which there is a very small percentage of our population right now, are in a very dangerous situation. I think this represents the type of question we've always had about, trials. How long do we wait for a safety trial when someone is, likely going to die anyway? I think a lot of people would take a greater risk. And in this situation, again, we know that it's safe when it's been used in many other situations. So the only question is, does it work? And your friend is not alone. Your friend is amongst now thousands and thousands around the world that are seeing real success here. And imagine if we have a cure, if we have something that could deal with, those that are having a severe reaction, which now studies are saying that we believe that the death rate may be as low as 0.6% or even lower. Even Dr. Fauci said this may just be like an intense flu, 0.1 to 0.2%. So this may just be like a flu. If we could take care of those that are having extreme reaction, perhaps we can get to a place where the rest of us who are just going to have a common cold when we get this, and then we'll all have herd immunity and we can protect our society. We can move forward much faster, get out of quarantine, and not worry about a future waiting for this mythological vaccine. We may not need it if we can figure out a way to handle those that are having severe reaction to coronavirus.
I appreciate you being on the program today. Dale Bigtree bringing us with a lot of good, pertinent information. And the time is now, not later. Dale, thank you for being on the Kelly Wright Show. Welcome back to the Kelly Wright Show. So joining me now is someone who I've had the pleasure of watching perform. She's an incredible, gifted musical artist. Her name is Naja Lewis, and she joins me now on the program. Naja, it's so good to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Kelly. It's an honor.
What are you doing now with your music in the wake of this COVID pandemic? Because you're known as an artist who brings so much grace and heart and soul to your music. And of course, many people who know you and watch you used to watch you perform there in the subways of New York City. And you're in New York City right now, and the subways and everything is shut down. So what are you doing with your music now?
You know what? I used to perform in the subways all the time, but thankfully I've been fortunate enough where I've been performing full-time as a musician. So I have a residency at the James New York Nomad Hotel for their Wine Exchange Hour, and I do the Moxie Hotel, and I just do a lot of private events and through my Naja Lewis Events company, which is weddings, proposals. And of course, unfortunately, everything is postponed or canceled. So with me, I definitely am following the stay-at-home order, and it's just been it's been difficult not performing because I can't remember a time where I performed nonstop. And I actually, because of social distancing, I had the idea that I would start a company because people are still, even though it's such a sad time, there are still events going on, and there are still anniversaries, and there's still unfortunately losses, and there's no way for people to see each other or send anything. So I thought of a company called A Musical Message, where I send personalized messages to anyone, and I personalize a song along with the video of their picture. It's kind of like you have your own single.
Wow, that's good. So you came up with that idea to try to bring comfort and some joy to people in the midst of this social distancing. And because of that, you're causing people to not feel isolated, but feel together through the power of music.
Correct. This definitely derived from my passion of music and my love of people, because that's part of the reason why I love to perform. My passion is performing, and I love to perform in front of people. And before this even happened, I actually, if I see like a friend or something or someone that was down, I would send a video or something saying like happy birthday. And then I thought, why not turn this into something everyone can do to bring healing and peace? Because I truly believe that, music is the universal language.
It is the universal language, and it touches so many hearts and minds and souls around the world. And it's a unifying factor, and that's something we need. And it's a good place to go to. So tell me what it's like right now in New York, because we've seen all the news, and I've lived in New York, I've worked there, and I have so much love and passion and respect for the people of New York. but I can't imagine what it's like to have an entire city of 8 point something million people shut down. What's it been like
It's
personally?
absolutely insane. Actually, I didn't know the severity of everything going on on April when I was actually when I found out all my gigs would be postponed. I still didn't quite understand how severe it was, and then they were saying, don't wear masks. And I actually did go out to record a video underground. I wrote a song about the virus, and everyone was wearing masks. And then I noticed more and more the news just kept getting worse and worse, and it's just so sad. And the only time I leave now, to be honest, is going to the market. I am quarantined indoors. It is kind of scary because New York City, you're so used to everyone being on the street, and it's just deserted. Deserted. It looks like you're living in some kind of movie. It doesn't even seem real.
Yeah. Well, Naja, I know you've got your guitar, your axe there with you, and when we come back from break, I'd like you to play something for us, if you don't mind. Serenade us with your music and bring us some hope and some joy in the midst of so much sorrow that's taking place right now in New York. As you know, the numbers of those dying is rising. This is what we expected this week from Governor Cuomo as well as the President of the United States. And I just so much appreciate you doing your part to try to bring some comfort and some peace in the midst of this global pandemic. When we come back, Naja Lewis will have the day after my final word. Don't go anywhere. We're coming right back. Welcome back to the program. And now for my final word. The numbers are sobering. In fact, the numbers are downright staggering. The number of deaths from COVID-19 pandemic is causing all of us around the world to have alarm. And as we've seen within the African American community, it's disproportionately affected. So we have to be on guard, not just Black Americans, but all Americans. In fact, all people around the world for that matter. One thing to be clear is that we should not give up on hope, not give up on faith, and certainly not give up on love. Those three elements will help us prevail against this ugly, hideous evil that is going throughout our world. And at the end of the day, when you watch the Kelly Wright Show, it's about information, but it's also about inspiration. Therefore, we want you to be righted, ignited, and united to spread not fear, but love, freedom, and peace. Speaking of that, we leave you now with my good friend Naja Lewis, who's going to deliver some of her own special brand of love, freedom, and peace. Naja?
Hello, love, I'm here. Just look for me. I'm waiting patiently for you to find me. Where on earth could you possibly be? Just look beneath the sky and suddenly you'll shine white. No, I don't want another broken heart. You saved me from the monsters. No, I